Hi, hello, welcome to Unknown Reviews. My name is Dylan, and today we are going to be talking about Earl Sweatshirt's Tabula Rasa. We're going to be analyzing it and, more importantly, seeing what you and I, as aspiring writers, can learn from it. So I think Earl does three things that make his verse not only abstract and intriguing, but also accessible and attainable for the everyday writer. Meaning, if you wanted to write a verse similar to this, with the same amount of depth and complexity, I think by doing these three things, that's definitely possible to achieve. So let's just jump into the first thing that I think Earl does really well on this verse. He uses simplicity as the foundation for complexity. Let's look at the first four lines of Earl's verse on Tabula Rasa to see exactly what I'm talking about. So with looking at this verse, it's pretty hard to tell what's going on without running directly to genius. Like, you can definitely infer some things, you can kind of guess with some context clues what he might be talking about, but in reality, on the surface, these four lines are pretty vague. Except for the final line, I know it's real even when I'm feeling bad. This is what I mean by using simplicity as the foundation for complexity. Despite all of the different references and imageries and all these different dynamics that are going on in these four verses that make it a little bit hard to parse, having that final line at the end, a very simplistic, almost kind of impossible to not understand line, is a really good way to give everyone a starting point, give everyone kind of a clue to what might be going on. So to put it concisely, context clues are a really great way to put everyone on the same playing field and to give the reader or listener a clue as to what you're talking about. I think this is incredibly important because once you have these context clues, all of the other abstract lines and, double, triple entendres and all those different things, they actually orbit around that central line or idea where things are a lot more simple to understand. I think this is the key to having really deep writing that is also accessible. As an audience, a lot of times we think of and describe complex writing as deep, something with a surface and then layers that you kind of dig down and uncover and explore. But as a writer, that's not really a helpful way to look at it. If you're trying to write something that's deep, I think you should think of it as a tower, something that actually gets built up, which needs a foundation of context clues or some simple concept or whatever is at the core of what you're writing about, that needs to be at the bottom. Because if you don't get what's at the core of the verse right, everything else kind of falls apart and feels disjointed. And in this set of four lines, that last one at the end, I know what's real even when I'm feeling bad, is a great way to set up the rest of the verse. So now that we have that foundation, let's start working backwards to figure out what Earl is really talking about in this set of lines. When he says tall tales tossed with the breeze, what tall tales is he talking about, right? When he says facts in the midnight wax, what does that mean? What does family tree sap mean, right? All of these phrases that are just kind of thrown out and sit there, how are they all connected? There is one more clue that kind of unlocks the whole thing, and it goes back to that idea of having one or two lines that everything else orbits around, and once you understand those, the rest of it kind of falls into place. So the one other clue that he has is the phrase midnight wax. It's unlike anything else in this set of four verses. It's the one thing that really kind of jumps out in this set of four verses as something that you probably either haven't heard before or it's just a very, very niche term. I felt incredibly silly once I found out what this meant because I feel like I should have known this, but wax is a slang term for vinyl. So really Earl is saying that he and his family, the people around him, keep facts, honesty, authenticity in the music and art that they create. You plug that idea into the rest of these four lines and then everything else falls into place. The first line, been to there and back, tall tales tossed to the breeze, reflects the many experiences Earl has had and signals that he's not lying about the things that he's been through. It's about that authenticity. And the things that he says in his music, the things that he says in his arts actually happened, and he's not capping, basically. Having that kind of confessional approach to his art, he's saying, is really something that is ancestral to him. It's a tradition that his family has done for a long time. It's in his blood or his family tree sap. So the next line after this, light leak through the leaves on familiar tracks, makes a lot more sense. It's really just a cleverly placed bit of imagery illustrating how he doesn't hide from his past but seeks to embrace it, understand it, and maybe even kind of talking about how he can't run from it. On top of this imagery, there's a great use of familiar with familial, really cool rhyme stuff that we'll kind of get into later in the video. But now, having these three verses kind of put in their context, you get the Cliff Notes version at the end, I know what's real even when I'm feeling bad. It It also not only serves as a summary, but a really great conclusion. Now you've got a deep thematic set of lines that play off of each other in a really interesting way that doesn't really feel that hard to understand once you have a few context clues to go off of. Again, simplicity is the foundation of complexity. The second thing that I think Earl does really well in this verse is that he doesn't allow rhyme scheme to limit him. Instead, he uses alternate rhyme schemes and, kind of gets flexible with rhyming to free up his writing and, really kind of focus on the concepts and what he's talking about. Rhyming shows up all over the place in this verse, not just at the end of each line. And not every rhyme is exact. Like, for example, with this set of verses that I'm going to show up on the screen here, chapters, balance, massive, and fragment all kind of rhyme with each other. They're not exact, but they're not so dissimilar that it takes you out of the verse completely. These are slant rhymes. This is very basic level poetry 101, but it's really, really useful to know how to use them if you've never used them before. Slant rhymes focus more so on the pronunciation of words and more so on how syllables within words interact with each other. So for example, chapters and balance have a somewhat similar syllable sound and also a very similar cadence. So you can kind of get away with rhyming those two with each other, especially if you pronounce them in a specific way. The benefit of this is that it opens up so many more words that you can rhyme with. It opens up so many more possibilities so that you can just say what you want to say. Now, slant rhymes and inexact rhymes are pretty standard stuff if you've spent any time messing around with poetry or rapping. But exact rhyming is still the dominant way to write verses, and I think using slant rhymes and other inexact forms of writing just gives you a lot more freedom to just say what you want to say. It works perfectly when writing with abstraction or complexity because you're better off spending more time making sure that side of things all makes sense. If you're spending a ton of time trying to figure out how to rhyme the end of every line perfectly with another, you run a fairly high risk of boxing in the effectiveness of the concept you're trying to convey. Earl uses inexact rhyming literally all over this verse, and he uses it not just at the end of verses, but in the middle of them too, which leads us into the next technique that he implements in this verse and in many others, internal and interlaced rhyming. Internal rhymes are fairly simple. They're rhymes that happen in the middle of lines rather than at the end. Right in the next line after Earl says, "I do what I have to" with the fragments, he says, "The madness method rampant these days, I let the panic pass me." Fragments, massive, and pass me match nicely and again allow Earl to simply say what he wants to say without having such a boxy rhyme scheme. But what's even cooler about internal rhymes is that they allow you to have two rhyme schemes running at once, one in the middle and one at the end. That's exactly what's happening in this set of lines, all while Earl continues the theme of staying clear-headed and true to himself despite the chaos of the world. So what you get here is not only a rhythmically complex set of lines, but also thematically and lyrically engaging, all while still just being really fun to listen to because Earl's flow is also great on this track and the beat is awesome. The last thing that I want to talk about, which is so simple in concept that people almost lazily do it, and that's imagery. This is the thing we all learned in 6th grade English, but the effectiveness of imagery in your writing really all comes down to application. It can be the anchor of your themes and what holds the key to what's really going on at the heart of your writing, or it can be completely and utterly pointless and filler. Let's circle back to the imagery briefly mentioned in Earl's opening line. Light leak through the leaves on familiar tracks. This is extremely simple and plainly beautiful, but as I mentioned before, it's about placement. If you're like me and struggle to come up with really compelling, poetic sounding imagery, if you overthink it and tend to overdo it, remember that placement is the key to impact. This one line of imagery is bolstered by the themes surrounding it, and using a simple slant of light on a flower in the woods as a representation of generations of familial identity is not only compelling enough on its own because of the theme supporting it, but it also doesn't get in the way of the theme it's trying to represent. It's simple. Like I said, simplicity is the first key to complexity. I want to look at a couple more examples of really effective, simplistic imagery by going over to ELUCID's verse. Okay, so maybe that's not the most simplistic use of imagery, but if you look at his verse a little bit more closely, he has the same context clues that Earl provides in his verse. So he starts us off with a very emotionally telling statement, off the strength, "I'm not as numb as I thought." Then he says, "I'm broken links, my circle's shrinking smaller." So we have two different kind of quick images here, right? What's brilliant about this is that he perfectly encapsulates what it means to be broken by illustrating a circle shrinking smaller. When you're broken, when you feel like you have nowhere to go, you feel like you're surrounded. And so I think this is a really great juxtaposition of something being breaking, but also being contained at the same time. And like, more aptly, something breaking because it's being contained. So this by itself, with the context clue of the first line, and then these two simple images, opens up a ton of different interpretations. ELUCID could be talking about his personal circle being cut off. It could be metaphorical, as in there's an actual noose around his neck that's getting smaller and his time is running up. Genius suggests that the broken chain link is related to a necklace getting smaller, so kind of having those like noose themes, right? But just with those two images and that context clue, we already have a ton of different interpretations that we can consider, which is a really good way to just immediately create intrigue. And that's all due to placement. Having that juxtaposition happening there really kind of just brings an interesting flavor to the verse. Now, things get a little bit stranger because instead of expanding on what he was talking about a little bit more, he throws another image at us right away. So we have, I'm broken links, my circle shrinking smaller, satellite resolve, my core is a cauldron. So now we have two more images that are barely directly explained, but as visually direct as you can be. Imagery like this is so interesting because it's another example of how you don't need big elaborate words and visual ideas to convey the intangibles of a feeling. ELUCID describes his heart and soul as a core, something that's central and critical to the engines of cars, to the hardware of computers, to literally the entire earth. Cores, in a way, are like essential to life, and that's such a more tangible way of expressing your inner being than just simply saying my heart, my soul, or my mind. And then going further to describe his core as a cauldron, something that you draw from, something that contains, is such an impactful way to illustrate this idea of ELUCID being in touch with the inner darkness and light within himself. And I think this is a great example of not only the placement of imagery being important, but really considering like the purpose and utility of what you're talking about. Like, for example, what a core does and what its function is and what it means, what the function of a satellite is, what the function of a cauldron is, and how does that relate to what you're trying to say. If you look at this set of lines, and he even kind of talks about this more in the next line where he says surrendered orbits, you can see that we're talking about something that is central, something that's being revolved around, drawn from. So when you consider the placement and function of all of these different images, right, you can tell that ELUCID is talking about something at the center of himself being examined or affected in some kind of way. You got a core, a circle, a satellite, something being orbited, right? Something revolving. It's this weird kind of like gravitational pull within. And then when you have the context clue in the beginning, I'm not as numb as I thought, it kind of answers and opens up the entire context of everything that ELUCID's talking about. We can see that ELUCID is talking about protecting what's at the center of his being, cross-checking what's really real and what's happening in reality with what can't be trusted. So this is another example of having imagery that gets really abstract, really out there, but having these anchors with like the first and last lines to really kind of help explain all the other complexities and have everything fall in place. Woods has a lot of really interesting stuff that goes on in his verse too, but I don't want to make this video too long, so let's keep the conversation going on in the comment section. But I do think that these three things are some of the highlights that you could really draw from and use in your own writing. So just to go over it again, we have simplicity being the key to complexity, using that as a foundation in your writing to build on top of instead of drill down into. And then second, we have using alternate rhyme schemes like slant rhymes, internal rhymes, and interlaced rhymes to open up your writing instead of worrying about having everything fit into a neatly wrapped rhyme box of exact rhymes, right? And the third one that we talked about is how to get imagery right and how to really use it in a way that bolsters the material instead of having it kind of be these weird red herrings that, end up distracting the viewer. Those are some of the things that I learned personally while listening to Tabula Rasa and, examining it a little bit more. Hopefully some of these things kind of translated to you. Maybe you noticed some things that I didn't notice or kind of want to add to what I was talking about, so please jump in the comment section. I want that to be as valuable as the video itself, if not more. I just want to get people talking about this track and and of course talking about Earl and Armand Hammer all the time because I just think they are incredible, generationally talented artists. So any conversation about them, in my opinion, is good conversation. So let's keep that going in the comment section. If you like this video, definitely check out my other lyrical analysis videos. I imagine the best place to start is probably my first video on Earl, but definitely check out the Billy Woods one, the ELUCID one as well. And let me know who else you'd like me to cover. If you like this video, please subscribe. Lets me know that I'm on the right track with the content that I'm making. And for the people who have been watching so far, thank you so much for your support. And yeah, I will see you guys next time. Have a good one.